Sometimes the heart finds love in the most unexpected places, with the most unlikely people. In a world where we're told who we should be with and what love should look like, real connection breaks every rule. In 1870s Colorado, Magnus Thorne towers 8 feet tall, a mountain man feared by all who cross his path. When Esther May arrives in his territory with her generous heart and gentle spirit, Magnus laughs at the idea that someone like her could ever want someone like him. But the wilderness teaches hard lessons about love and survival. When fate forces them together, something beautiful begins to grow between the giant who thinks he's a monster and the woman who sees past his rough exterior. What happens when she discovers she's carrying his child? A child he never believed he deserved to have. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Colorado peaks like a shroud, and Magnus Thorne preferred it that way. 8 feet of bone and muscle, he moved through the dawn silence with surprising grace for a man who could snap a pine sapling with his bare hands. His cabin sat perched on a rocky outcrop 3 miles above Pine Ridge, close enough to civilization. To trade his furs, but far enough to keep the curious away. Magnus had carved his refuge from the wilderness with nothing but determination and an axe. Every log had been felled by his hands, every stone fitted with the precision of a man who understood that survival depended on attention to detail. The cabin's interior revealed an unexpected truth about its giant inhabitant. While rough-hewn and functional, every surface bore the subtle marks of artistry. The rifle stock mounted above his fireplace wasn't merely practical, it was a masterwork of carved wood, depicting a mountain scene so lifelike you could almost hear the wind through. The pines. Few people in Pine Ridge had seen the delicate scrollwork Magnus carved into that walnut stock during the long winter months. They knew him only as the mountain man who appeared at Jeremiah Walsh's trading post twice a season, silent and imposing, his pale blue eyes scanning the room like a predator, assessing threats. Children scattered when his shadow fell across the mercantile's doorway. Women crossed themselves and hurried past. Men found urgent business elsewhere. Magnus told himself he preferred their fear. Fear was honest. Fear kept them at a distance where they couldn't see the loneliness that gnawed at him like hunger, couldn't witness the careful way he handled delicate things when he thought no one was watching. The trading post on this particular September morning buzzed with more activity than usual. A wagon train had arrived the previous evening. Families heading west before winter locked the mountain passes. Magnus needed ammunition and coffee, supplies that would see him through until spring. But he hesitated at the mercantile's threshold. Too many people crowded the narrow space, their voices creating a din that set his nerves on edge. "That's him," someone whispered as Magnus finally ducked through the doorway, his massive frame blotting out the morning light. "That's the giant." Magnus ignored the murmurs and approached Walsh's counter. The portly merchant's hands trembled slightly as he gathered the requested items, though whether from fear or excitement at the rare cash sale, Magnus couldn't tell. "Fine morning for trading, Magnus," Walsh ventured, his voice pitched higher. "Than usual?" Magnus grunted his acknowledgement and placed silver coins on the scarred wooden counter. The exact amount, as always. No haggling, no conversation, no lingering longer than necessary. "Shame about the Hutchins family," Walsh continued, unable to resist filling the silence. "Lost their youngest to fever 3 days back. That's what drove them to join up with the Morrison train. Sometimes a change of scenery helps with grief, I reckon." Magnus's hand stilled over his purchases. He remembered grief, remembered how it could hollow a person out until nothing remained but the shell of who they used to be. He said nothing, but something in his expression must have softened, because Walsh grew bolder. "There's a woman with them," the merchant continued, "came all the way from Missouri by herself. Esther May Fletcher, seamstress by trade. Lost her whole family to cholera last spring. Parents, brother, even her intended. Brave soul. Heading west alone like that. Magnus gathered his supplies without comment, but his gaze drifted toward the wagon train camp visible through the mercantile's grimy window. Cookfires sent thin streams of smoke into the crisp air, and he could see figures moving between the covered wagons, like ants tending their colony. She's quite the seamstress, from what I hear. Walsh pressed on, seemingly determined to extract some response from his taciturn customer. Mrs. Morrison says her needlework is the finest she's ever seen. Course, she's not much to look at, a big woman if you catch my meaning, round as a barrel and twice as sturdy. But they say she's got a sweet disposition. The cruel laughter that erupted from Magnus surprised even him. It burst from his chest like a physical thing, harsh and bitter in the small space. Several customers turned to stare, their faces reflecting shock at the sound. A sweet disposition, Magnus repeated, his voice rough from disuse, as if that matters in this country. He shook his head, still chuckling without humor. A soft woman won't last a month out here. This land eats the weak. Walsh's face flushed red. Now, see here. Magnus, there's no call for... But Magnus had already turned away, his purchases tucked under one massive arm. He pushed through the crowd gathered around the store's entrance, their whispered conversations dying as he passed. Just as he reached the doorway, a figure stepped directly into his path. She was exactly as Walsh had described, round and solid, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a plain bonnet. Her brown eyes met his without flinching. Though he towered over her like a tree over a wildflower, she wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, practical but well made, and her hands, he noticed her hands immediately, were small and neat, with the calluses of honest work. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I believe you dropped this." She held out a silver coin, one of the pieces he'd placed on Walsh's counter. Magnus stared down at her, acutely aware that everyone in the mercantile had gone silent, watching this unprecedented encounter between the feared mountain man and the stranger. "I didn't drop anything," he said finally. "Perhaps not," Esther May replied, her expression serene. "But someone did, and you were the last person to leave. I thought you might want to check." Magnus patted his coat pockets and found them intact, his money accounted for. He looked back at the woman, Esther May Fletcher, the seamstress from Missouri, and saw something in her steady gaze that unsettled him. Not fear, not disgust, just a quiet assessment that made him feel suddenly exposed. "Keep it," he said gruffly, then pushed past her into the morning air, but he paused just outside the mercantile and glanced back through the window. Esther May had turned the coin over to Walsh and was examining a bolt of fabric with the focused attention of someone who understood quality. Her fingers traced the weave with the same reverence Magnus felt when working with fine wood grain. As if sensing his scrutiny, she looked up and met his gaze through the glass. For a moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of two people who understood loneliness. Then Magnus turned away and strode toward the trail that led home, disturbed by the encounter in ways he couldn't name. That evening, as he carved by lamplight, Magnus found himself thinking about steady, brown eyes and small, capable hands. The rifle stock in his lap, a piece he'd been working on for months, seemed to take on a life of its own under his knife. Without conscious thought, he began carving a new detail into the mountain scene, a small wildflower growing from a crevice in the rocks. Delicate and persistent against the harsh landscape, he set the work aside before completing the flower, troubled by his own impulse. Tomorrow, he would focus on practical matters, checking his trap lines, smoking meat for winter, reinforcing his cabin against the coming snows. He had no time for flights of fancy about auburn-haired women who looked at him without fear. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of gentle voices and the rustle of wool skirts, of hands that could create beauty from simple cloth, just as his could coax art from rough wood. Magnus woke before dawn, with the unsettling realization that for the first time in years, his cabin felt empty rather than peaceful. The wagon train would move on within days, carrying Esther May Fletcher toward whatever new life awaited her in the Western Territories. Magnus told himself he was grateful. The last thing he needed was complications, especially the kind that came with soft brown eyes and a voice that spoke to him without fear. He dressed in the pre-dawn darkness and prepared for another day of solitude, pushing away thoughts of small hands and steady gazes. The mountains demanded his full attention, and Magnus Thorne had learned long ago that survival meant accepting the harsh truth of his isolation. Still, as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, his gaze drifted toward the valley where the wagon train slept, and he found himself wondering if the seamstress from Missouri ever looked toward the mountains and thought of the giant who lived among them. The blizzard struck 3 days earlier than any weather Magnus had seen in 15 years of mountain living. He'd felt it coming in his bones, the way old injuries ached before storms, but even his experience hadn't prepared him for the fury that descended from the peaks like the wrath of an angry god. By noon, the wind howled through the pines with such violence that even the ancient giants bent like saplings. Snow fell not in flakes but in sheets, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of white chaos. Magnus secured his cabin and settled in to wait out nature's tantrum, grateful for his well-stocked shelves and stone fireplace. It was the horses screaming that drew him out into the storm. No creature should sound like that, raw terror and pain cutting through the wind like a blade. Magnus pulled on his heaviest coat and fought his way toward the sound, each step a battle against snow that reached past his knees. The horse's cries grew weaker as he struggled through the drifts, following a path that led down toward the main trail. He found them a quarter-mile from his cabin, a bay mare thrashing in a snowdrift, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle, and beside her in the snow, a motionless figure in blue wool. Magnus's heart lurched with recognition even before he cleared the snow from her face. Esther May Fletcher lay unconscious, her lips blue with cold, her breathing shallow. The wagon train had moved on 3 days ago, but somehow she'd been left behind, caught on the mountain when the storm hit. The mare had to be put down, her leg was shattered beyond help, and the kindness was swift. Magnus carried Esther May's limp form through the driving snow, her slight weight deceptive in his arms. She felt fragile as bird bones despite her solid build, and terrifyingly cold. His cabin had never seemed smaller than when he laid her on his narrow bunk near the fire. Magnus worked with the efficiency of a man who understood that hesitation meant death. He stripped away her wet clothes with clinical detachment, wrapping her in his warmest furs and blankets. Her breathing remained dangerously shallow, her skin pale as winter sky. For 2 days, Magnus fought death for a woman he barely knew. He fed the fire constantly, keeping the cabin warm as a summer day. He forced warm broth between her lips when she was lucid enough to swallow, held her when chills racked her body so violently that the bunk frame shook. During her fevered delirium, she spoke of people named Sarah and Thomas, of quilting circles and church socials, of a life that seemed as distant from his mountain existence as the moon. On the 3rd morning, Esther May opened her eyes and looked directly at him with clear recognition. "You saved my life," she said simply, her voice hoarse but steady. Magnus busied himself with the coffee pot, uncomfortable with her direct gaze. "Horse broke its leg, had to put it down." Poor creature. Esther May struggled to sit up, then seemed to realize she wore only his spare shirt, her own clothes, hanging by the fire. Color flooded her cheeks, but she didn't cower or cry out in alarm. "I suppose I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything." Magnus kept his back to her, focusing on the mundane task of preparing breakfast. "Storm caught you. Could happen to anyone fool enough to be on the trail this late in the season. I missed the wagon train." Esther May's voice carried a weight of regret. "My mare threw a shoe 2 days back, and I couldn't keep pace. Mr. Morrison said they couldn't wait. Too dangerous to delay with winter coming." He was right, of course, but it left me rather stranded. Magnus turned to face her, coffee pot in hand. Morrison left you, alone. Something in his tone made Esther May's eyes widen slightly. For the first time since he'd known of her existence, Magnus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had made men fear him in his younger days. He gave me supplies and directions to Pine Ridge, Esther May said. Quickly, it wasn't unreasonable, really. I'm the one who fell behind. Like hell, it wasn't unreasonable. Magnus set the coffee pot down harder than necessary. You don't abandon people, not out here. The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. Magnus had spent so many years alone that he'd forgotten how protective. Instincts could flare without warning. He cleared his throat and returned to his cooking, disturbed by the intensity of his reaction. Well, Esther May said after a moment, I'm grateful you found me, regardless of how I came to need finding. Over the next few days, as the storm raged beyond the cabin walls, an uneasy routine developed between them. Esther May proved to be a surprisingly unobtrusive presence. She mended his torn shirts with neat, nearly invisible stitches, using thread from a small sewing kit she'd salvaged from her saddlebags. She cooked meals that actually had flavor, transforming Magnus's simple provisions into something approaching cuisine. Most remarkably, she seemed unafraid of him. Not comfortable, perhaps. She moved carefully in the small space, always maintaining a respectful distance, but not terrified either. She spoke to him as she might any man, asking about the storm's likely duration, commenting on the cabin's sturdy construction, sharing small observations about mountain life. You built this yourself, she said on the fourth evening, running her hand along the smooth-hewn logs of the wall. Had to. No one else up here to do it. It's beautiful work. The joints are so precise they barely need chinking. Esther May traced a particularly elegant corner joint with her fingertip. You must have quite a lot of experience with woodworking. Magnus shrugged, uncomfortable with the admiration in her voice. A man learns what he needs to survive. But that night, by the fire's glow, he found himself telling her about the techniques he'd learned, the tools he'd made, the satisfaction of creating something solid and lasting from raw timber. Esther May listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed her own appreciation for skilled craftsmanship. I suppose it's not so different from sewing, she mused, taking something in its natural state and shaping it into something useful and beautiful. Never thought of it that way, Magnus admitted. My grandmother taught me to see the dress in the fabric before I made the first cut, Esther May continued. She said the material would tell you what it wanted to become. If you listened carefully enough. Magnus understood exactly what she meant. He'd felt the same thing countless times with wood, sensing the grain's natural direction, finding the form that wanted to emerge from the raw lumber, that someone else, especially someone so different from him, might share that understanding. Struck him as both unlikely and profound. As the storm continued, the artificial intimacy of their situation began to wear on Magnus's nerves. Esther May's presence filled spaces in his life he hadn't realized were empty. The cabin felt more like a home with her quiet movements, her soft humming as she worked, the rustle of her skirts, and the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow. But intimacy bred familiarity, and familiarity led to expectations. Magnus had learned that lesson hard in his younger years. People always wanted more than he could give, always pushed for deeper connections that left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. Better to keep walls intact, to maintain the distance that protected them both. On the sixth morning, the storm finally broke. Magnus woke to silence so profound it felt ominous after days of howling wind. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, revealing a world transformed by snow. The weather's cleared, he announced unnecessarily. Trail will be passable in a day or two. Esther May, who'd been quietly darning one of his socks, looked up with an expression he couldn't read. Of course, you'll want your space back. It's not about what I want. The lie came easily, practiced from years of denying his own needs. You can't winter here. Not enough supplies for 2 people. No, of course not. Esther May folded the sock with careful precision and set it aside. I wouldn't want to impose further on your kindness. Magnus told himself he felt relieved. The strange domesticity of the past week had been an aberration, a temporary arrangement born of necessity. Soon, Esther May would return to Pine Ridge, find her way west come spring, and his life would return to its familiar rhythms. But as he prepared to dig them out of the snowdrifts, Magnus found his gaze lingering on small details he'd grown accustomed to. Esther May's sewing thimble, catching the firelight as she worked, the silver inherited from her grandmother that she wore like a talisman, the way she hummed old hymns under her breath, the careful arrangement she'd made of his few books, organizing them by subject rather than leaving them in the haphazard pile where he'd kept them. These small feminine touches had transformed his bachelor refuge into something warmer, more welcoming. In 2 days, when the trail cleared enough for travel, all traces of her presence would disappear. The cabin would return to its former state, and Magnus would have only memories of what it felt like to share his space with someone who saw past his fearsome exterior. He told himself that was exactly what he wanted. The alternative. Allowing Esther May Fletcher to matter to him was too dangerous to contemplate. Magnus had learned long ago that caring about people only led to pain, and he'd structured his entire life around avoiding that particular vulnerability. But as he worked to clear the snow from his door, Magnus found himself moving slower than usual, as if delaying the moment when the outside world would intrude on their temporary sanctuary. For just a little while longer, he could pretend that gentle voices and small kindnesses were permanent fixtures in his life, rather than brief gifts to be treasured and then released. The trail remained impassable for another week, and Magnus found himself torn between relief and growing unease. Each morning brought the same routine. He would check the path leading down to Pine Ridge, returning with a carefully neutral expression to report that the snow remained too deep for safe travel. Esther May accepted these delays with remarkable grace, but Magnus caught her watching him sometimes with a thoughtful expression that made him wonder what she saw beneath his gruff exterior. She had a way of looking at him as if she were solving a puzzle, one piece at a time. "You don't have to sleep on the floor," she said on the 8th evening, watching him arrange his bedroll near the fireplace. Magnus froze in the act of spreading his blankets. "The bunk's yours while you're here. It's your bed, in your cabin." Esther May's voice carried a practical note that somehow made the conversation feel less dangerous. "We're both adults, and Lord knows there's little enough warmth to spare. I won't think less of you for practical arrangements." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Magnus wasn't ready to examine. He'd grown accustomed to her presence during the day, but nights were different. Nights made him acutely aware of her breathing, the small sounds she made in sleep, the way moonlight through the window touched her auburn hair. "Floor's fine," he said gruffly. "I'm used to it." But that night, as wind howled around the cabin, and temperatures dropped below anything they'd yet experienced, Magnus woke to find Esther May shivering violently despite the heavy furs piled on the narrow bunk. Her teeth chattered so hard he could hear them across the small room. Without allowing himself time to think, Magnus gathered his blankets and approached the bed. "Move over." Esther May's eyes opened wide and questioning in the dim light. "You're freezing," Magnus said by way of explanation. "This is about survival, nothing more." She shifted to make room, and Magnus settled carefully beside her, acutely aware of every point where their bodies almost touched. He lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the way her warmth gradually seeped through the layers of fabric between them. "Thank you," Esther May whispered. "I know this isn't easy for you." Magnus said nothing, but something in his chest loosened at her words. She understood his discomfort without judging him for it, recognized his gesture as the kindness it was, rather than expecting more than he could give. Gradually, their shared warmth chased away the bitter cold. Esther May's shivering subsided, and her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Magnus remained awake longer, disturbed by how right it felt to have her curled against his side, how natural it seemed to share this small space with someone who didn't fear him. Morning brought awkwardness along with pale sunlight. Magnus woke first, as was his habit, but found himself reluctant to disturb the woman sleeping peacefully against his shoulder. Esther May's face in sleep looked younger, softer, with none of the careful composure she maintained during waking hours. Her hand rested on his chest, small and pale against the dark wool of his shirt. When she finally stirred, opening brown eyes that took a moment to focus, Magnus saw awareness flood her features along with a blush that colored her cheeks. "Pink, good morning," she said quietly, making no immediate move to pull away. "Morning." Magnus's voice came out rougher than intended. Storms passed. Should be able to clear more of the trail today. They separated with careful politeness, both pretending the night's intimacy had been purely practical. But something had shifted between them, a barrier that had been slowly eroding, finally giving way to something more complex and fragile. During the day, Magnus found himself noticing details he'd missed before. The way Esther May tilted her head when concentrating on her sewing, the small scar on her left hand that spoke of some childhood accident, the unconscious grace with which she moved around the cabin's confined space, never bumping into furniture or disturbing his carefully arranged possessions. She had, he realized, been making herself as unobtrusive as possible during her stay. Her few belongings remained neatly contained in one corner. She cooked only when he seemed too busy to bother with meals. She mended his clothes without being asked, but left them folded on his chair rather than presuming to put them away. Was the consideration of someone accustomed to being unwanted, and the recognition stirred something protective in Magnus's chest. That evening, as Esther May prepared another meal from his simple provisions, Magnus found himself really watching her work. Her movements were efficient and practiced, turning beans and salt pork into something that actually tasted good. She hummed while she cooked, old hymns mostly, melodies that seemed to warm the cabin as much as the fire. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" Magnus asked, surprising himself with the question. Esther May glanced up from the pot she was stirring. "My mother, mostly. She said a woman who couldn't make a decent meal from whatever was available wouldn't last long as a wife." Her expression grew wistful. She was probably right, though it didn't matter in the end. "Your intended," Magnus said carefully. "The one who died in the cholera outbreak. James." Esther May's voice carried old grief, but no fresh pain. "We'd known each other since childhood. Our families assumed we'd marry eventually, and neither of us saw reason to argue with the assumption. But you didn't love him." The words came out before Magnus could stop them, too direct and personal for someone he barely knew. But Esther May didn't seem offended by the bluntness. "I cared for him," she said slowly. "James was a good man, kind, steady, reliable. Love might have grown between us, given time." She paused, stirring the pot with unnecessary attention. "But no, I didn't love him. Not the way the poets write about, anyway." Magnus found himself curious about what kind of love Esther May might dream of, what kind of man could capture her quiet attention. The thought bothered him more than it should have. "What brought you west?" he asked instead. "After losing your family, most people would seek comfort in familiar places. There was nothing left for me in Missouri." Esther May's tone remained matter of fact, but Magnus heard the pain underneath. "James's family made it clear I wasn't welcome after he died. Said I must have brought bad luck to attract such tragedy. My seamstress work barely paid for a room above the milliner's shop, and the ladies who'd been my customers started finding reasons to take their business elsewhere. So you decided to start over?" "I decided to try." Esther May ladled stew into 2 bowls, her movements precise and controlled. "Oregon Territory needs seamstresses, and I thought perhaps a place where no one knew my history might be more welcoming." Magnus accepted his bowl with a grunt of thanks, but his mind worked on what she'd told him. Esther May Fletcher had lost everything, family, intended husband, livelihood, home, and instead of surrendering to grief, she'd chosen to fight for a new beginning. It took courage he wasn't sure he could have summoned at her age. They ate. In comfortable silence, the wind outside a distant murmur compared to the previous night's fury. As Esther May cleared their dishes, Magnus found himself studying her profile, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way her hands moved with quiet efficiency, even in the simplest tasks. Later, as she sat mending another of his shirts by firelight, Magnus retreated to his workbench in the cabin's corner. The wooden box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, had remained untouched for years, but tonight he found himself lifting the lid and staring at the contents within. His mother's wedding ring lay nestled in faded velvet, a simple gold band that seemed to catch and hold the firelight. Margaret Thorne had worn it for 37 years, through poverty and plenty, through the raising of 7 children and the loss of 4. She'd placed it in Magnus's palm the day before she died, her fever-bright eyes holding his with desperate intensity. "This ring has seen real love," she'd whispered. "Not the easy kind that comes with sunshine, but the kind that grows stronger in darkness. Don't let your father's poison convince you that you're not worthy of such love. Promise me, Magnus. Promise me you'll try to find what your father and I never had." Magnus had made the promise to ease his dying mother's mind, but he'd never believed it possible. How could a man like him, too large, too rough, too marked by violence, ever inspire the kind of love his mother described? Better to accept the solitude that kept others safe from his potential for destruction. But sitting in his cabin with Esther May's quiet presence filling the space, Magnus found himself wondering if his mother had been wrong about his capacity for gentle love, or if he'd been wrong about his unworthiness of it. He closed the box and replaced it beneath the floorboard, but the ring's simple gold band lingered in his memory like an unspoken possibility. Tomorrow, if the weather held, he would escort Esther May back to Pine Ridge. She would find work, passage west, a new life among strangers who might appreciate her quiet strength and generous heart. Magnus told himself this was what she deserved, a chance at happiness far from the isolation and hardship of mountain living. But as he prepared his bedroll near the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was preparing to lose something precious he'd never even allowed himself to hope for. The seed. Morning brought clear skies and temperatures that, while still bitter, no longer threatened immediate death to anyone caught outside. Magnus woke to find Esther May already up, packing her few belongings with the methodical care of someone accustomed to frequent moves. "Trail should be passable," Magnus said, stating the obvious because the alternative, acknowledging what her departure meant, felt too dangerous. "Yes, I imagine so." Esther May folded her spare dress with precise movements, her face composed but unreadable. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness, Magnus. You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same." Esther May paused in her packing, looking at him with an expression that held gentle disagreement. "No," she said quietly, "not anyone. And certainly not anyone who would have cared for me with such consideration." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning Magnus didn't want to examine too closely. He busied himself with preparing for the journey down to Pine Ridge, checking his rifle and gathering the supplies they'd need for the trek. But as he worked, Magnus found himself stealing glances at Esther May, noting the careful way she handled her grandmother's recipe book, a leather-bound collection of handwritten instructions that she'd rescued from her saddlebags. The pages were water-stained but readable, filled with measurements and techniques passed down through generations of women who'd understood that feeding people was an act of love. "My grandmother wrote most of these," Esther May said, noticing his attention. "She taught me that a good meal could heal more than just hunger, could bring comfort, show care, build connections between people." Magnus thought of the meals they'd shared over the past week, how Esther May had transformed his simple provisions into something approaching feast. She'd been showing him care in the only way their circumstances allowed, and he'd been too focused, on maintaining distance to fully appreciate the gift. "You'll make some family very happy," Magnus said carefully. "Out west." Something flickered across Esther May's features. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. "Perhaps," she said, "though I've learned not to count on happiness. It seems to be one of those things that comes when you're not looking for it." The journey to Pine Ridge took most of the morning, with Magnus breaking trail through snow that reached his knees and would have been impassable for someone of normal height. Esther May followed in his footsteps, her breathing visible in the cold air, but her pace steady. She didn't complain about the difficult conditions or ask for rest stops, matching his determined progress with quiet endurance. As they descended toward the settlement, the familiar sounds of civilization reached them. Axes splitting wood, the lowing of cattle, children's voices carrying on the thin air. Magnus felt each sound like a weight settling on his shoulders, reminding him of the world below where Esther May belonged, and he remained forever an outsider. Pine Ridge's main street bustled with activity despite the recent storm. People emerged from buildings to stare at the unlikely pair, the giant mountain man and the woman he escorted. Magnus ignored their curious gazes, focusing instead on delivering Esther May safely to the boarding house where she could secure. Lodging Mrs. Campbell, the boarding house proprietor, greeted Esther May with the kind of flustered attention reserved for unexpected guests. "My dear, we thought you'd perished in that terrible storm. When the Morrison train reported you missing, we feared the worst." "I was fortunate," Esther May said simply, her gaze finding Magnus's for a brief moment. "I found shelter." Mrs. Campbell's eyes widened as she took in Magnus's imposing presence. "Oh my! Well, yes, I can see that you did. How providential." Magnus shifted uncomfortably under the woman's obvious curiosity. This was exactly why he avoided the settlement, the questions, the stares, the way people treated him like a dangerous animal that might turn unpredictable at any moment. "I should go," he said to Esther May, shouldering his rifle. "Storms cost me a week of trap checking." "Of course." Esther May's voice remained steady, but Magnus caught something in her expression that might have been regret. "Thank you again." "For everything." Magnus nodded curtly and turned to leave, but Esther May's voice stopped him. "Magnus?" He looked back to find her approaching with something in her hands, a small cloth bundle tied with string. "Some bread and preserves," she explained, offering the package. "For your journey back up the mountain. I know you have supplies, but—" She trailed off, seeming suddenly uncertain. Magnus stared down at the bundle, recognizing it for what it was. A gesture of care disguised as practicality. Esther May had used her precious ingredients to make something for him, thinking of his comfort even as she prepared to leave his life forever. "Thank you," Magnus said roughly, accepting the gift. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and he felt the calluses on her small hands, evidence of a lifetime of useful work. For a moment, they stood frozen in the boarding house doorway, surrounded by the bustle of settlement life, but somehow isolated in their own small space. Magnus found himself memorizing details. The way afternoon light brought out copper highlights in Esther May's hair, the steady warmth of her brown eyes, the gentle strength that seemed to radiate from her compact frame. Then Mrs. Campbell cleared, her throat meaningfully, and the spell broke. Magnus turned and walked away without looking back, but he felt Esther May's gaze following him until he disappeared around a corner. The cloth bundle in his hand seemed to carry her warmth, a tangible reminder of kindness freely given. The climb back to his cabin took longer than usual, though whether from the difficult trail conditions or his own reluctance to return to solitude, Magnus couldn't say. The structure that had been his refuge for 15 years looked smaller somehow when he finally reached it, its walls seeming to echo with the absence of soft humming and gentle movements. Magnus built up the fire and prepared. A simple meal, but the cabin felt hollow without Esther May's presence. Her careful arrangements of his books remained, along with subtle signs of feminine habitation, a hand towel folded just so, the wood pile stacked with unusual precision, the absence of dust from surfaces she'd quietly cleaned. That evening, as he sat by the fire with his carving, Magnus found himself working on the rifle stock again. The small wildflower he'd begun during Esther May's stay seemed to demand completion now, and his knife moved almost without conscious direction. Under his hands, the delicate bloom took shape, a mountain columbine, Colorado's state flower, growing impossibly from a crack in the granite. It was a testament to beauty persisting in harsh conditions, to life finding a way to flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Magnus stared at the finished carving, disturbed by its symbolism and his own compulsion to complete it. 3 days later, he found an excuse to return to Pine Ridge. His supplies were adequate, but a man could always use more coffee, more ammunition. At least, that's what he told himself as he made the familiar journey down from his mountain sanctuary. At Walsh's trading post, Magnus learned that Esther May had taken work with the Henderson family, whose wife had been overwhelmed by the care of twin infants and a household that seemed to expand daily. Mrs. Henderson had hired Esther May as a seamstress and general helper, providing room and board in exchange for her services. "She's a godsend," Walsh confided as he gathered Magnus's purchases. Poor Mrs. Henderson was at her wits' end before that woman arrived. Now the house runs smooth as clockwork, and the babies have never looked better cared for. Magnus grunted. Acknowledgement, but privately he felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy. The Henderson family had what he couldn't offer: security, community, a proper place for someone like Esther May. As he prepared to leave the trading post, Magnus caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Esther May emerged from the Henderson house carrying a basket of laundry, her movements brisk and purposeful. She wore a different dress than he remembered, green wool that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, and her hair was arranged more formally beneath a crisp white cap. She looked settled, content even, and Magnus told himself he should be glad for her good fortune. But watching her disappear into the Henderson house, he felt the first sharp edge of what might have been loss. That night, alone in his cabin, Magnus sat staring at the completed wildflower carving. The delicate bloom seemed to mock him with its beauty, reminding him of possibilities he'd been too frightened to explore. For one brief week, his life had held warmth and companionship, the promise of something beyond mere survival. Now that possibility lived 3 miles down the mountain, close enough to haunt him, but distant enough to remain safely out of reach. Magnus told himself this was for the best, that Esther May deserved better than the harsh isolation he could offer. But as winter deepened and the long nights stretched endlessly before him, Magnus found himself wondering if his mother had been right about love growing stronger in darkness, and whether he'd been a fool to let his chance for such love walk away without a fight. Winter settled over the Colorado mountains with a vengeance that reminded Magnus why most sensible people fled to warmer climates before the snows came. By December, drifts reached the cabin's eaves, and the silence grew so profound that even his own breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Magnus told himself he preferred the isolation. The brutal cold kept casual visitors away, ensuring the solitude he'd cultivated for 15 years, but memories of soft humming and gentle conversation seemed to echo in the cabin's corners, making the quiet feel oppressive rather than peaceful. He threw himself into winter tasks with grim determination, checking trap lines on snowshoes, smoking meat, repairing equipment, anything to keep his mind occupied. But even the familiar rhythms of survival couldn't completely banish thoughts of brown eyes and careful hands, of the way Esther May had transformed his rough living space into something approaching a home. The carved wildflower on his rifle stock caught the firelight each evening, a constant reminder of the week when his life had held possibilities beyond mere endurance. Magnus found himself studying the delicate petals with something approaching obsession, remembering the woman who'd inspired its creation. On a particularly bitter morning in mid-December, Magnus woke to find fresh horse tracks leading toward His cabin. The prints were several hours old, partially filled with wind-blown snow, but unmistakably there. Someone had approached during the night and left again without making contact. Magnus followed the trail to where it disappeared among the trees, but found no other sign of the mysterious visitor. The tracks were too large for Esther May's mare, which had died in the storm anyway, and too purposeful for a casual traveler lost in the wilderness. 3 days later it happened again. This time Magnus caught a glimpse of the rider from his cabin window, a dark figure on horseback, too distant to identify but watching his refuge with obvious interest. When Magnus stepped outside with his rifle, the figure melted into the forest like smoke. The visits continued sporadically through the winter, always at dawn or dusk when visibility was poor. Magnus began sleeping more lightly, his old instincts for danger awakening after years of peaceful mountain living. Someone was watching him, studying his habits, and the attention felt anything but friendly. His father's hunting knife, hidden in a drawer beside his bed, seemed to pulse with malevolent energy during the long winter nights. Magnus had carried the blade for 30 years without ever using it in anger, but its weight felt familiar in his palm, a reminder of the violence that had shaped his early life. Ezra Thorne had been a brutal man who'd taught his sons that strength meant dominance, that love was weakness to be beaten out of children before it could poison their character. Magnus carried scars both visible and hidden from his father's lessons, marks that had driven him to the mountains in search of something his family home had never provided. Peace. The knife was all Magnus had left of his father, kept not from sentiment, but as a tangible reminder of the man he'd sworn never to become. Ezra Thorne had died alone and hated, abandoned by his children and despised by his community. Magnus had vowed to break that cycle, to build a life free from the violence that had defined his bloodline. But the mysterious watcher in the woods stirred old fears about the poison in his heritage, the capacity for cruelty that might be waiting for the right provocation to emerge. In January, Magnus made one of his infrequent trips to Pine Ridge for supplies. The settlement huddled beneath. Snow-laden roofs, smoke rising from chimneys in lazy spirals that spoke of warm hearths and comfortable homes. Magnus felt the familiar pang of exclusion as he approached Walsh's trading post, knowing that his presence would cast a shadow over whatever conversations had been flowing before his arrival. But this time, Walsh's face showed concern, rather, the nervous fear when Magnus entered the store. "Magnus, thank God you're here," the merchant said, wringing his hands anxiously. "We've got trouble, the kind that needs a man like you." Magnus set his shopping list on the counter and waited for explanation, though every instinct told him he wouldn't like what was coming. "Ute war party," Walsh continued, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty store. "Spotted 2 days ago near the Henderson place. Tom Morrison thinks they're scouting for a larger raid, maybe planning to hit us when the weather breaks." The news hit Magnus like a physical blow. The Henderson place, where Esther May lived and worked, where she tended children and thought herself safe from the wilderness's dangers. "How many?" Magnus asked, his voice deadly calm. Morrison counted. 6, but there could be more. Walsh's hands shook as he gathered Magnus's supplies. "We've sent word to Fort Collins for cavalry support, but it'll be weeks before help arrives. Meanwhile, we're just sitting here waiting for them to make their move." Magnus absorbed this information, with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. 6 Ute warriors could devastate a settlement like Pine Ridge if they struck at the right moment. The townspeople were farmers and merchants, not fighters, and their weapons were better suited for hunting rabbits than defending against experienced raiders. "What's Morrison's plan?" Magnus asked. "Bring everyone into town, fortify the church and trading post, wait for the cavalry." Walsh's voice carried little confidence in the strategy. "He's asked the outlying families to abandon their homesteads. Temporarily? And the Hendersons? Stubborn as mules, the lot of them." Walsh shook his head in frustration. "Tom Henderson insists his property is too valuable to abandon, says he'll defend it himself if necessary. He's got that woman helping with the children, Miss Fletcher, and he won't hear of moving them to safety. The protective rage that surged through Magnus was immediate and overwhelming. The thought of Esther May trapped in a remote homestead, with only Tom Henderson's dubious marksmanship standing between her and a Ute war party, made his vision blur with fury. "Henderson's a fool," Magnus said flatly. "Aye, but a determined one. Maybe you could talk sense into him. He might listen to someone with your reputation." Magnus doubted Tom Henderson would welcome advice from the mountain giant most people crossed themselves to avoid, but the suggestion gave him an excuse to do what every protective instinct demanded: ensure Esther May's safety. The Henderson homestead sat in a valley 2 miles west of Pine Ridge, a collection of log buildings that looked prosperous but vulnerable. Magnus approached openly, his rifle held in a non-threatening position but ready for quick use. The silence felt ominous. No children playing in the yard, no smoke from the outdoor kitchen, none of the usual signs of a busy household. Tom Henderson emerged from the main house as Magnus approached, a shotgun cradled in his arms and suspicion written across his weathered features. Behind him, Magnus caught a glimpse of movement at a window, a woman's silhouette that made his heart race with recognition. "Magnus Thorne," Henderson said, his tone carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you down from your mountain." "Heard about your Ute problem," Magnus replied. "Came to offer assistance." Henderson's eyebrows rose in surprise. The mountain man's reputation for avoiding involvement in settlement affairs was well established, making his offer both unexpected and significant. "That's generous of you," Henderson said slowly, "but we can handle our own troubles." "Can you?" Magnus's gaze swept the homestead's defenses, or lack thereof. 6 warriors could take this place in minutes. You've got women and children to protect. As if summoned by his words, Esther May appeared in the doorway behind Henderson. She wore a simple brown dress and white apron, her hair neatly arranged beneath a cap, but her face showed the strain of the past few days. When she saw Magnus, something flickered in her expression. Surprise, relief, perhaps a hint of gladness she quickly suppressed. "Magnus," she said quietly, stepping forward with the grace he remembered. "It's good to see you." The simple words carried a weight of meaning that made Magnus's chest tighten. She looked well, if tired, but the sight of her in this vulnerable position, with danger lurking in the surrounding forest, made his protective instincts roar to life. "Miss Fletcher," Magnus acknowledged with a slight nod. "I trust you're well." "Well, enough," Esther May replied, "though these have been anxious days." Henderson glanced between them, his expression suggesting he was beginning to understand the true reason for Magnus's unexpected visit. "You know Miss Fletcher?" "We've met," Magnus said carefully, "during the storm last month." The explanation seemed to satisfy Henderson's curiosity, though Magnus caught a speculative look in the man's eyes. "Well, since you're here, perhaps you'd join us for dinner. Martha's been fretting about the situation, and your presence might ease her mind." Magnus wanted to refuse. Social meals were complications he'd spent years avoiding, but the invitation gave him a chance to assess the homestead's defenses and ensure Esther May's safety, so he accepted with gruff thanks. The Henderson house was warm and welcoming, filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. Martha Henderson, a worn but kind-faced woman, greeted Magnus with nervous courtesy, while their twin sons, boys of perhaps 8 years, stared at the giant with undisguised fascination. "Boys, mind your manners," Martha scolded gently. But Magnus found their open curiosity refreshing after years of fearful avoidance from most children. Esther May moved efficiently around the kitchen, helping to prepare the meal with the same quiet competence Magnus remembered. She seemed to have found her place in the Henderson household, fitting into their rhythms as naturally as if she'd been born to domestic life. But Magnus noticed the way she positioned herself near the windows, the quick glances she cast toward the darkening forest, the tension in her shoulders that spoke of constant vigilance. The threat of Ute raiders had affected everyone in the household, but Esther May bore it with the same stoic endurance she'd shown during their week in his cabin. During dinner, Tom Henderson outlined his defensive preparations with the confidence of a man who'd never faced truly determined adversaries. He spoke of blocked windows, stockpiled ammunition, and signal fires, as if they could guarantee safety against experienced warriors. Magnus listened without comment, but his assessment of the situation grew grimmer with each detail. The Hendersons were brave but naive, their preparations more likely to create a false sense of security than actual protection. If the Ute war party decided to attack, these good people would die believing they'd done everything possible to defend themselves. After the meal, as Martha settled the children for the night, Magnus found himself alone with Esther May in the kitchen. She worked quietly, cleaning dishes with movements that seemed designed to avoid drawing attention to herself. "You shouldn't be here," Magnus said finally. Esther May paused in her washing, then resumed with deliberate care. "Where else would I be? The Hendersons need help with the children and I need employment. Morrison's organizing a safe haven in town. You'd be protected there. I've made commitments here." Esther May's voice carried quiet determination. "These people have been kind to me. I won't abandon them when they need me most." Magnus recognized the stubborn loyalty in her tone, the same quality that had driven her to attempt an impossible journey west rather than accept charity in Missouri. Esther May Fletcher didn't abandon people, even when wisdom demanded retreat. "The Utes won't care about your loyalty," Magnus said bluntly. "They'll kill you just as quickly as anyone else." Esther May turned to face him, her brown eyes steady and unafraid. "Then I suppose I'll have to trust that God and good friends will see me through." Her gaze lingered on his face with unmistakable meaning, and Magnus felt something shift in his chest. She was including him in that category of good friends, believing that his presence might make a difference in their survival. The trust in her expression was both humbling and terrifying. Magnus had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, the burden of caring for someone whose safety depended on his actions. But looking at Esther May, brave, stubborn, impossibly precious, he realized he'd already accepted that burden the moment he'd carried her unconscious form through the blizzard. "I'll stay," Magnus said quietly, "until the danger passes." Relief flooded Esther May's features, though she tried to hide it. "The Hendersons will appreciate the extra protection." Magnus nodded, but they both understood his decision had little to do with the Henderson family's welfare. He was staying for her because the thought of leaving Esther May vulnerable to the violence lurking in the forest was more than he could bear. That night, as Magnus settled into the Hendersons' barn with his rifle across his knees, he felt the weight of his father's knife against his hip and wondered if the capacity for violence might sometimes serve a noble purpose. For 15 years, he'd hidden from the darker aspects of his nature, afraid of what he might become if he allowed that violence free rein. But as he kept watch over the woman sleeping safely in the house beyond, Magnus began to understand that some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant risking the peace he'd worked so hard to achieve. The days that followed settled into a routine of watchfulness and growing tension. Magnus divided his time between scouting the surrounding forest for signs of Ute movement and helping Tom Henderson improve the homestead's defenses. The work kept his hands busy, but his mind remained focused on the woman who moved quietly through the Henderson house, caring for children and maintaining normalcy in the face of looming danger. Esther May's small hand mirror caught the morning light as she prepared for another day of domestic duties, but Magnus noticed how often she paused to gaze out windows, her reflection showing worry lines that hadn't been there during their week in his cabin. The threat of violence had changed something fundamental in her careful composure, introducing a fragility that made his protective instincts burn even fiercer. "You're watching me," Esther May said quietly one morning, as Magnus returned from his dawn patrol of the property. They stood alone in the Henderson kitchen, the family still sleeping upstairs. Esther May held a cup of coffee in both hands, steam rising between them like a delicate barrier. "I'm watching for threats," Magnus corrected, though he couldn't deny the truth in her observation. "The Utes could strike at any time. Is that the only reason?" Esther May's brown eyes searched his face with the same careful attention she'd shown when mending torn fabric, looking for flaws that needed addressing. Magnus found himself unable to answer. The honest response, that watching, her had become as essential as breathing, that her safety mattered more than his own, felt too dangerous to voice. Instead, he accepted the coffee she offered and retreated into safer territory. "Henderson's youngest boy has been asking questions about tracking," Magnus said. "Might be worth teaching him some basic skills." Esther May smiled, recognizing his deflection, but choosing not to press. "Billy's fascinated by everything you do. Yesterday he spent an hour trying to walk as quietly as you do through the forest." The image of the 8-year-old attempting to mimic his movements brought an unexpected warmth to Magnus's chest. Children usually fled from his presence, but the Henderson boys had adapted to his towering frame with the resilience that made childhood possible. They treated him as a curiosity rather than a threat, asking endless questions about mountain life and listening to his gruff responses with rapt attention. "Kids need to understand the wilderness," Magnus said. "Out here, ignorance kills." "You're good with them," Esther May observed. "Patient in ways that might surprise people who only know your reputation." Magnus shifted uncomfortably. Kindness toward children felt natural, but having someone witness and acknowledge that gentleness left him feeling exposed. Children don't know enough to be afraid of the right things, or perhaps they're wise enough to see past the surface to what lies beneath. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that made Magnus's pulse quicken. Esther May had a way of seeing through his carefully constructed defenses, finding the parts of himself he'd thought successfully hidden from the world. Before he could formulate a response, Tom Henderson's voice called from upstairs, announcing, "The start of another day." The moment of intimacy dissolved as the household came to life around them, but Magnus carried Esther May's words with him as he prepared for another day of vigilance. The afternoon brought visitors, a patrol from Pine Ridge led by Tom Morrison, checking on the outlying homesteads and sharing news from the settlement. Morrison was a lean, serious man who'd appointed himself unofficial leader of the community's defense efforts. His gaze lingered on Magnus with a mixture of respect and unease. "Any sign of the war party?" Morrison asked as the men gathered in. "The Henderson parlor tracks along the creek bed yesterday," Magnus reported. "Old, but they've been watching the property." Morrison's face grew grim. "Same pattern at the other homesteads. They're learning our routines, looking for weaknesses." "When will they strike?" Tom Henderson asked, his confidence wavering for the first time since Magnus's arrival. "Soon," Magnus said with certainty. "They've had time to study us, much longer, and they risk our defenses improving or cavalry arriving from the fort." Morrison nodded agreement. "We're urging all families to relocate to town within the next 2 days. The church can accommodate everyone, and we've got enough armed men to mount a proper defense." "I've told you before," Henderson said stubbornly, "I won't abandon my property to raiders. This homestead represents years of work." "Property can be rebuilt," Morrison argued. "Lives can't." The debate continued, but Magnus's attention drifted to the kitchen, where Esther May worked quietly, her movements betraying the tension she tried to hide. She'd chosen to stay with the Henderson family despite the danger, loyalty overriding self-preservation in a way that was both admirable and terrifying. That evening, after Morrison's patrol had departed with promises to return in 2 days, Magnus found himself helping Esther May with the dinner preparations. The domestic task felt strange, but not unwelcome, chopping vegetables while she seasoned meat, their movements coordinated like partners in a familiar dance. "Morrison's right about relocating," Magnus said carefully. "The church would be safer." Esther May's hand stilled over the pot she was stirring. "Would you leave?" The question caught Magnus off guard. What do you mean? If you were in Tom Henderson's position, if this were your property, your family's future, would you abandon it to raiders? Magnus considered the question seriously. He understood Henderson's reluctance better than he'd admitted. The homestead represented security, hope for the future, the tangible proof that a man could carve something meaningful from the wilderness. I'd do whatever kept the people I cared about safe, Magnus said finally, even if it meant losing everything else. Everything else doesn't matter if the people you love are dead. The words emerged with more emotion than Magnus had intended, revealing feelings he'd tried to keep carefully contained. Esther May looked up from her cooking, her brown eyes wide with recognition of what he'd inadvertently confessed. Magnus, she said softly, her voice carrying a tenderness that made his chest tighten. Before either could say more, Martha Henderson bustled into the kitchen with her twins in tow, filling the space with chatter about bedtime stories and tomorrow's lessons. The moment of revelation passed, but its impact lingered in the careful way Esther May avoided meeting Magnus's gaze for the rest of the evening. That night, as Magnus kept watch from the barn, he found himself thinking about love and the terrible vulnerability it created. For 15 years, he'd lived free from such entanglements, accepting loneliness as the price of safety. But Esther May had changed something fundamental in his careful isolation, awakening feelings he'd thought permanently buried. The sound of horses moving through the forest brought Magnus instantly alert. Multiple riders approaching with the stealth of experienced hunters. He counted hoofbeats, 6 horses, matching the reports of the Ute war party's size. Magnus moved silently through the barn, checking his weapons and preparing for conflict. The weight of his father's knife pressed against his hip, a reminder of the violence that had shaped his bloodline. For years, he'd avoided situations that might require such brutality, but protecting Esther May and the Henderson family was worth risking the darkness he'd worked so hard to contain. The riders passed without attacking, but their message was clear. They were ready to strike, waiting only for the right moment. Magnus remained vigilant through the long night, watching over the people sleeping peacefully in the house beyond, knowing that tomorrow might bring the violence he'd spent 15 years trying to escape. As dawn approached, Magnus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months before. He would fight to protect what mattered most, even if it meant embracing the very nature he'd fled to the mountains to avoid. Some things were worth the risk of losing oneself, and Esther May Fletcher had become one of those precious, dangerous things. The mirror in her room caught the first light of morning, reflecting a world about to change forever. Magnus watched the sunrise paint the forest in shades of gold and crimson, and prepared himself for whatever darkness the day might bring. The attack came at dawn, but not from the direction Magnus expected. A single rider approached the Henderson homestead openly, hands raised in a gesture of parley. Magnus watched from concealment, rifle ready, as the figure drew closer. Not a Ute warrior, but a white man in worn buckskins, his face weathered by years of frontier living. "Hello, the house," the stranger called. "I'm looking for a man called Magnus Thorne." Magnus felt ice form in his veins. No one should know his full name, let alone seek him out in this remote location. He'd been careful to use only his first name in Pine Ridge, maintaining the anonymity that had kept him safe for 15 years. The stranger reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded paper, yellowed with age. Even from a distance, Magnus recognized what it was, a wanted poster bearing his likeness and the name he'd hoped was buried forever. "I know you're here, Magnus," the man called. "Or should I say, Mountain Magnus McLean. That's the name. On this here bounty notice, says you're wanted for murder in Wyoming territory, offers $1,000 for your capture, dead or alive." The Henderson family emerged from their house, confusion and growing alarm evident on their faces. Tom Henderson held his shotgun, but his attention was divided between the stranger and Magnus, who stepped slowly from his concealment. "What's this about?" Henderson demanded. though wariness had crept into his voice. Magnus moved forward with deliberate calm, his rifle held casually but ready for quick use. The bounty hunter, for that's clearly what the man was, smiled with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. "Name's Jake Cartwright," the hunter said, his gaze fixed on Magnus. "Been tracking Magnus McLean for the better part of 3 years. Imagine my surprise when I heard tell of an 8-foot mountain man living up in these peaks. Not many men fit that description." Magnus. Esther May's voice carried confusion and something that might have been hurt. She stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed, waiting for an explanation that Magnus wasn't sure he could provide. 20 years ago, Magnus said quietly, his words carrying across the morning air, "I killed 3 men in a saloon fight. In Cheyenne, they were trying to force themselves on a serving girl who couldn't have been more than 16. I stopped them." The stark admission hung in the air like gun smoke. Magnus saw Tom Henderson's grip tighten on his shotgun, saw Martha pull her children protectively closer. But it was Esther May's expression that cut deepest, not fear or revulsion, but a careful reassessment that suggested she was recontextualizing everything she thought she knew about him. Self-defense, was it? Cartwright laughed harshly. "That's not how the witnesses told it. Said you went into a rage, broke one man's neck with your bare hands, crushed another's skull against the bar. Third one you gutted with that knife you carry. Folks said it was like watching a wild animal tear apart its prey." Magnus felt the familiar darkness stirring in his chest, the same cold fury that had consumed him that night in Cheyenne. He'd tried to intervene reasonably, tried to talk the men out of their assault. But when they turned on him with drunken violence, something primal had awakened. The same capacity for brutality that had marked every man in his bloodline. "Those men were going to rape a child," Magnus said, his voice deadly quiet. "I couldn't let that happen." "Maybe so," Cartwright conceded, "but you didn't stop with defending the girl. Witnesses say you kept hitting that last fellow even after he was down, even after he'd stopped moving. That's what made it murder instead of justified killing." The words struck Magnus like physical blows because they contained a grain of truth he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. He had lost control that night, had allowed the violence to consume him until he was no longer defending innocence but indulging the savage nature he'd inherited from his father. "Why now?" Magnus asked. 20 years is a long time to pursue. A bounty. Cartwright's smile grew wider. Bounty's been increased. Seems one of those dead men had a son who's done well for himself, made his fortune in silver mining up in Montana. He's offering $5,000 for the man who killed his father, and he's not particular about the condition of the body. $5,000 was more money than most men saw in a lifetime. Magnus understood now why Cartwright had spent years tracking him, why the hunter's eyes gleamed with anticipation of wealth. "I'll come with you," Magnus said simply. "Leave these people out of it." "Magnus, no." Esther May stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. "You can't just surrender to this man." But Magnus was already calculating distances, angles, the likelihood of protecting the Henderson family if violence erupted. Cartwright wasn't alone. Magnus could sense other presences in the forest, probably the men who'd been posing as Ute, raiders to mask their true purpose. "Smart man," Cartwright said approvingly, "though I should mention we've got the homestead surrounded. My partners have been watching this place for weeks, learning everyone's routines. You try anything heroic, and these good folks will pay the price." As if summoned by his words, 3 more men emerged from the forest, all armed and positioned to command the approaches to the house. Magnus recognized the tactical positioning. These weren't simple bounty hunters, but professionals, possibly former soldiers familiar with military strategy. "The Ute raids," Tom Henderson said slowly, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "That was you." "Needed to keep the locals nervous," Cartwright confirmed. "Can't have cavalry patrols or armed citizens interfering with our work." "Amazing how a few horse tracks and some scattered arrows can convince folks that hostile Indians are on the warpath." Magnus felt sick at the deception. The fear that had gripped Pine Ridge, the danger he'd thought threatened Esther May and the children, it had all been manufactured to isolate him from potential help. The bounty hunters had played the entire community, using their terror as a tool to facilitate his capture. "You're making a mistake," Magnus said, his voice carrying the first edge of the violence he'd kept leashed for 20 years. "These people have done nothing to you, and they'll keep doing nothing as long as you cooperate." Cartwright's hand rested casually on his pistol grip, though I admit having that pretty seamstress here does complicate things. "Can't leave witnesses to testify about our methods." The threat to Esther May ignited something white-hot in Magnus's chest. For 20 years, he'd used isolation to protect others from the monster he carried within, but faced with the possibility of harm coming to the woman he'd grown to love, that careful control began to fracture. "Touch her and I'll kill you all," Magnus said quietly, the words carrying absolute conviction. Cartwright laughed. "There's the Magnus McLean I've heard about. The man-killer who crushed skulls like eggshells. Tell me, how many people have you murdered since Cheyenne? How many bodies are buried up in those mountains?" "None," Magnus replied truthfully. "I came here to escape that life, but it followed you anyway, didn't it?" Cartwright's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd found his quarry's weakness. "Violence always finds men like us, Magnus. We can run from it, hide from it, but it's in our blood. Sooner or later, we all become what we're meant to be." Magnus saw Esther May's reflection in the morning light, bouncing off her small hand mirror, her face showing a complex mixture of fear, determination, and something that might have been understanding. She was seeing him clearly for the first time, not the gentle mountain man who'd saved her from the storm, but the killer he'd tried so hard to leave behind. "Magnus," she said softly, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "Whatever you did 20 years ago, it doesn't define who you are now." But Magnus wasn't sure that was true. As Cartwright and his men closed in, as the violence he'd spent 2 decades avoiding rushed toward him like an avalanche, Magnus felt the familiar darkness rising in his chest. The capacity for brutality that had driven him to the mountains was stirring to life, awakened by the threat to everything he'd come to value. Perhaps Cartwright was right. Perhaps some men were simply born to violence, destined to destroy everything they touched, despite their best intentions. Magnus looked at Esther May's face, memorizing her features before the monster inside him broke free, and wondered if she would still recognize him when the killing was done. The standoff stretched through the morning like a taut wire ready to snap. Cartwright's men maintained their positions around the homestead while Magnus calculated odds and angles, searching for any advantage that might protect the innocent people caught in this deadly game. Esther May had retreated into the house, with Martha Henderson and the children, but Magnus could feel her watching from the windows, her presence both comforting and terrifying. If violence erupted, she would be in immediate danger, and the thought of losing her to his violent past made his vision blur with rage. "We can do this easy or hard," Cartwright said, lighting a cigarette with casual confidence. "Easy way, you. Come along peaceful, and these folks never see us again. Hard way, well, let's just say there'll be a lot more graves to dig." Magnus studied the bounty hunter's face, recognizing the cold calculation of a man who'd killed for money before. Cartwright wasn't bluffing about the threat to the Henderson family. These weren't lawmen motivated by justice, but professionals who would eliminate witnesses without hesitation. "I need to gather my things," Magnus said finally. "Personal effects from the cabin." Cartwright's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What? A kind of personal effects? Things that belonged to my mother, keepsakes I'd rather not leave behind." It was partially true. Magnus did have items of sentimental value hidden in his cabin. But more importantly, the structure contained weapons and tactical advantages that might shift the odds in his favor. If he could separate Cartwright's men, isolate them from the innocent civilians, he might find a way to end this without bloodshed. "Nice. Try," Cartwright said with a knowing smile. "But I wasn't born yesterday. We'll send a couple of boys with you. Make sure you don't get any clever ideas." Magnus had expected as much. Fair enough, but the woman comes with me. What? Cartwright's casual demeanor flickered with surprise. Miss Fletcher has belongings at the cabin too, items she left there during the storm. Magnus kept his voice steady, revealing nothing of the desperate plan forming in his mind. She'll want to collect them before I disappear forever. The lie came easily, born of necessity and desperation. Esther May had left nothing at his cabin. But if Magnus could get her away from the Henderson homestead, away from the children, who would certainly die if violence erupted here, he might find a way to protect at least one person he cared about. Cartwright considered the request, his gaze shifting between Magnus and the house where Esther May waited. Why should I care what she wants? Because you need her alive as leverage, Magnus said bluntly. Kill the Henderson family and you lose nothing. They're strangers to me. But Miss Fletcher is different. She matters. You harm her and I stop cooperating entirely. It was a dangerous gambit, revealing his feelings for Esther May to men who would use those emotions as weapons against him. But Magnus had run out of subtle options. If protecting her required exposing his vulnerability, he would pay that price. Gladly. Cartwright's smile returned, predatory and satisfied. Now that's interesting. The mountain man has found himself a woman worth dying for. How romantic. Do we have a deal? We do. Cartwright gestured toward two of his men. But Henderson and his family stay here with me, just to ensure your continued cooperation. Any tricks at the cabin, and they'll pay the price. Magnus nodded, curtly, hating the necessity but accepting the terms. At least this way, Esther May would be away from the immediate danger, giving him options he wouldn't have otherwise. Miss Fletcher, Magnus called toward the house. We need to collect your belongings from the cabin. Esther May emerged slowly, her face pale but composed. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand the dangerous game they were playing, and her brown eyes met his with quiet trust that humbled him. Of course, she said simply. I should gather my things. The journey to Magnus's cabin took most of the afternoon, with Cartwright's men maintaining careful distance behind them. Magnus and Esther May rode in silence, both acutely aware that they were walking into what might be their final confrontation. As they climbed toward his mountain refuge, Magnus found himself memorizing details he'd taken for granted. The way afternoon light filtered through the pine canopy, the sound of wind through high branches, the scent of snow and evergreen that had been his constant companions for 15 years. Magnus, Esther May said quietly as they neared the cabin. Whatever happens, I want you to know— Don't, Magnus interrupted gently. Save your words for after we survive this. But Esther May shook her head, determination overriding caution. If we don't survive, I need you to understand. What you did 20 years ago, the reasons behind it, none of that changes who you are. Now, you saved me from the storm. You've protected the Henderson family. You've shown nothing but kindness to children who weren't afraid to see your true nature. Her words struck deeper than any weapon, cutting through the self-hatred Magnus had carried for 2 decades. In Esther May's eyes, he wasn't defined by his worst moment, but by the totality of his choices, the man he'd fought to become rather than the monster he'd feared he was. Esther, Magnus said, her name emerging like a prayer. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, she replied firmly. We're going to find a way through this. They reached the cabin as shadows lengthened toward evening. Magnus's refuge looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he remembered. But hidden beneath its rustic exterior were resources that might tip the balance. Weapons, ammunition, and most importantly, the hand-carved cradle that represented everything he'd never allowed himself to hope for. Magnus had begun carving the piece during the long winter nights, working by firelight when sleep eluded him. The cradle was a masterwork of patient craftsmanship, every surface smooth as silk, every joint fitted with precision that would last generations. He'd told himself it was merely practice, a way to keep his hands busy during the endless darkness. But in his heart, Magnus had been carving a future, imagining a child who might someday sleep safely within those perfectly crafted walls, a family that might fill his solitary cabin with laughter and love. The cradle represented possibilities he'd thought permanently beyond his reach. Now, as Cartwright's men positioned themselves around the cabin's perimeter, Magnus understood that his dreams of family and belonging hung by the thinnest of threads. One wrong move, one moment of miscalculation, and everything he'd dared to hope for would be destroyed. "Beautiful workmanship," one of the bounty hunters commented, running his fingers along the cradle's curved rails. "Shame to see such skill wasted on a killer." Magnus said nothing, but his hands clenched into fists at the casual dismissal. The cradle wasn't just woodwork, it was hope given physical form, love expressed in the only language his scarred hands truly understood. As evening approached and Cartwright's deadline drew near, Magnus made his final preparations. Hidden weapons were checked and positioned. Escape routes were mentally rehearsed. Most importantly, he caught Esther May's gaze and held it, communicating. Without words, the plan that might save them both. She nodded slightly, understanding passing between them like electricity. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and perhaps that shared courage would be enough to overcome the violence that threatened to consume everything Magnus had built in his mountain sanctuary. The cradle sat in the cabin's corner, a testament to dreams that might never be realized, but Magnus found strength in its presence. He'd carved it with love and hope, and those emotions, rather than the darkness his father's knife represented, would guide him through the deadly hours ahead. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Magnus prepared to discover whether love could triumph over the violent legacy that had shaped his bloodline, and whether a man could truly escape the sins of his past when everything he valued hung in the balance. The attack came at midnight, but not from the direction anyone expected. Esther May's labor pains had begun at sunset, waves of agony that left her gasping and clinging to the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Magnus stared in shock as she doubled over, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, a roundness he'd somehow failed to notice beneath her loose-fitting dresses. "The baby," Esther May whispered, her face pale with pain and something that might have been shame. "Magnus, I'm so sorry. I should have told you." "How long?" Magnus demanded, his mind reeling as pieces fell into place. The careful way she'd positioned herself during their week together, the loose clothing, the morning sickness he'd attributed to her ordeal in the storm. 6 months! Esther May gasped as another contraction seized her. "Since our time in the cabin. Since that night." She didn't need to finish. Magnus remembered the evening when comfort had turned to tenderness, when two lonely souls had found solace in each other's arms. He'd thought it a moment of weakness, a temporary lapse in the careful distance he maintained from all human connection. But it had created life. The woman he loved was carrying his child, and she was giving birth in the middle of a deadly standoff with men who would kill them both without hesitation. "Jesus Christ," one of Cartwright's men muttered from his position near the door. "What do we do now?" Outside, Magnus could hear movement in the darkness. The other bounty hunters repositioning themselves, uncertain how this development affected their plans. Through the cabin's single window, he caught glimpses of lantern light moving between the trees as Cartwright's men tried to assess the situation. "Keep her quiet," the bounty hunter inside hissed, raising his rifle toward Esther May. "Last thing we need is her screaming, bringing half the territory running." Magnus moved with the fluid violence of a predator protecting its mate. His massive hand closed around the bounty hunter's throat before the man could complete his threat, lifting him clear off the ground with terrifying ease. The rifle clattered to the floor as the hunter clawed desperately at Magnus's iron grip. "You won't touch her," Magnus said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of death. "You won't even look at her while she's birthing my child." The hunter's eyes bulged with terror and oxygen starvation, his face turning purple as Magnus's fingers tightened. For a moment the old darkness surged through Magnus's veins, the same savage fury that had consumed him in that Cheyenne saloon 20 years ago. but Esther May's voice cut through the red haze of violence. "Magnus!" she gasped between contractions. "Don't! Please! The baby needs you focused, not lost in rage." Her words reached him as nothing else could have. Magnus looked down at the dying man in his grasp, then at Esther May laboring to bring their child into the world, and made a choice that would have seemed impossible just moments before. He released the bounty hunter, who collapsed to the floor, gasping and retching. Instead of finishing the kill, Magnus turned his back on the defeated man and knelt beside Esther May. "What do you need?" Magnus asked, his voice gentle despite the violence still singing in his blood. "Clean cloth," Esther May managed. "Hot water, and something to cut the cord when the time comes." Magnus moved with purpose, gathering supplies while keeping one eye on the recovering bounty hunter. The man remained on the floor, massaging his bruised throat and staring at Magnus with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Outside, voices carried on the night air, Cartwright demanding answers, his men reporting the unexpected complication. Magnus could hear frustration and uncertainty in their tones. The bounty hunters had planned for resistance, for violence, for any number of tactical challenges. They hadn't planned for the birth of a child. "This is a gift," Magnus realized, speaking more to himself than to Esther May. "They won't risk the noise of gunfire while you're in labor, too dangerous with other settlers nearby." Esther May nodded, understanding the tactical advantage, even through her pain. "How long until dawn?" 6 hours. Maybe 7. Magnus pressed a cool cloth to her forehead, marveling at her composure even in extremity. "Think you can hold out? That long? Babies come when they're ready," Esther May replied with a weak smile. "This one seems determined to make an entrance tonight." Through the next hours, Magnus found himself living in 2 worlds simultaneously. Part of him remained the deadly mountain man, tracking every sound outside the cabin, calculating angles and distances for the violence that must eventually come. But another part, a part he'd never known existed, was utterly absorbed in the miracle unfolding before him. Esther May labored with quiet courage, biting down on a leather strap to muffle her cries. Magnus held her hand, offering what comfort he could while marveling at the strength required to bring life into the world. He'd thought himself familiar with courage from his years of wilderness survival, but watching Esther May endure hours of agony to birth their child redefined his understanding of bravery. The bounty hunter, who'd given his name as Peters, sat sullenly in the corner, nursing his bruised throat and making no further aggressive moves. The display of Magnus's barely leashed violence had thoroughly cowed him, but Magnus knew the man would turn dangerous again the moment circumstances shifted. "You really didn't know?" Peters asked during a lull between contractions, his voice hoarse from the near strangulation. Magnus shook his head. "She never told me." "Why not?" Magnus looked down at Esther May's sweat-dampened face, thinking of the shame he'd seen in her eyes when the truth emerged. "Because she's a good woman who thought she was protecting me from obligation." Peters laughed harshly. "Hell of a woman to birth a child in the middle of a gunfight." "Hell of a woman, period," Magnus replied with quiet pride. As the hours passed, Magnus found himself thinking about the cradle he'd carved through the long winter nights. The piece sat in the cabin's corner, its smooth curves and perfect joints, a testament to dreams he'd never dared voice. He'd carved it thinking of some impossible future, never imagining that future was already growing within the woman he loved. Esther May's labor intensified as dawn approached, her quiet endurance giving way to urgent need. Magnus found himself thrust into the role of midwife, guided by half-remembered conversations with his mother about the births of his younger siblings. "I can see the head," Magnus announced, his voice tight with emotion. "The baby's coming, Esther. Just a little more." Outside, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Cartwright's patience had finally run out, and reinforcements were arriving to end the standoff once and for all. But Magnus barely registered the threat. his entire world focused on the child emerging into his trembling hands. The baby arrived, with the sunrise, small and perfect and absolutely silent. For a terrifying moment, Magnus thought they'd lost the child, but then Esther May touched the tiny chest with one finger and the infant drew its first breath, letting out a cry that seemed to fill the entire world with possibility. "A son," Magnus whispered, cradling the child with hands that had dealt death but now held new life. "We have a son." Esther May smiled through her exhaustion, reaching up to touch the baby's face. "He's beautiful. Perfect." The moment of peace was shattered by Cartwright's voice from outside the cabin. "Time's up, Magnus. You've had your fun, but this ends now. Come out with your hands empty, or we're coming in shooting." Magnus looked down at his newborn son, then at Esther May, and felt something shift in his chest. The darkness that had driven him to the mountains was still there, the capacity for violence that marked his bloodline. But it was balanced now by something stronger, the fierce protectiveness of a father, the desperate love of a man who'd found what he was meant to fight for. He wrapped the baby in soft cloth from Esther May's sewing kit, then placed the child gently in the hand-carved cradle that had waited so long for this moment. The sight of his son, nestled in the bed he'd made with his own hands, filled Magnus with a sense of rightness he'd never experienced before. "Stay with him," Magnus told Esther May, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "No matter what happens, protect our son." Esther May's eyes widened with understanding and fear. "Magnus, don't do anything foolish." But Magnus was already moving, the birthing cloth still in his hands, a simple piece of fabric that now carried the weight of everything he valued in the world. The cloth had been part of his son's first moments, and he would carry it into battle, as a reminder of what he fought to preserve. The violence that had shaped his past was about to collide with the love that defined his future, and Magnus Thorne was finally ready to discover which force would prove stronger. Magnus stepped from the cabin into the pale dawn light, his hands empty as promised, but his eyes burning with deadly intent. The baby's first blanket, woven from his finest furs and Esther May's most delicate fabric, remained inside, wrapped around the son he'd never expected to have. Cartwright and 5 men formed a semicircle around the cabin's entrance, their weapons trained on Magnus, but their expressions uncertain. The bounty hunter's confident demeanor had cracked during the long night, and Magnus could see doubt creeping into the man's calculating eyes. "Well, well," Cartwright said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Congratulations are in order, I suppose, though I can't say bringing a child into this situation shows much sense." "Let them go," Magnus said quietly, his voice carrying across the morning air with terrible clarity. "The woman and baby have nothing to do with your quarrel with me. Afraid I can't do that." Cartwright's grip tightened on his rifle. Too many witnesses now, too many complications. Magnus had expected this response, had planned for it during the long hours of Esther May's labor. He'd used the time to study his opponents, noting their positioning, their weapons, the subtle hierarchies that governed their group. Most importantly, he'd identified the weakness that would doom them all. "You made a mistake, Cartwright," Magnus said, taking a step forward that made several bounty hunters flinch. "You let me protect something that matters more than my own life." Before anyone could react, Magnus moved with the explosive violence of his father's bloodline unleashed in service of love rather than rage. His massive frame covered the distance to the nearest gunman in 2 strides, hands closing around the man's rifle before the surprised hunter could pull the trigger. The weapon splintered like kindling in Magnus's grip, jagged pieces of wood and metal becoming improvised weapons as he whirled among Cartwright's men. 20 years of mountain living had honed his strength to supernatural levels, while the desperate need to protect his family awakened reflexes he'd thought permanently buried. The first man went down with a shattered collarbone, screaming as Magnus's elbow caught him with the force of a sledgehammer. The second managed to fire a wild shot that went high before Magnus's fist caved in his ribcage, driving the breath from his lungs in a whistling gasp. Cartwright shouted orders that were lost in the chaos, his careful plan dissolving into confusion, as the giant they'd thought to capture became an unstoppable force of destruction. Magnus moved among them like a force of nature, every blow calculated to disable rather than kill, but delivered with enough power to end resistance permanently. "Thaw." "Cabin!" Cartwright screamed, swinging his rifle toward the structure where Esther May and the baby waited. "Burn them out!" The threat to his family ignited something primal in Magnus's chest. He'd been fighting with restraint, trying to minimize the carnage despite his fury. But the moment Cartwright targeted innocent lives, the last of Magnus's self-imposed limitations fell away. Magnus caught Cartwright's rifle barrel in one massive hand, the metal groaning under the pressure of his grip. With his other hand, he grabbed the bounty hunter by the throat, lifting him clear of the ground as easily as a child might lift a doll. "You shouldn't have threatened my family," Magnus said, his voice barely recognizable as human. For a moment, the same darkness that had consumed him in Cheyenne 20 years ago surged through his veins. Cartwright's life hung by the thinnest of threads, his eyes bulging with terror as Magnus's fingers tightened around his throat. It would be so easy to complete the killing, to crush the life from the man who'd threatened everything Magnus held dear. But then he heard it. The soft cry of his newborn son from within the cabin, a sound that cut through the red haze of violence like sunlight through storm clouds. His child was alive, safe, perfect, in ways that Magnus had never been. The baby deserved better than a father who solved problems with murder. Instead of crushing Cartwright's throat, Magnus hurled the bounty hunter against the nearest tree with bone-jarring force. Cartwright hit the trunk with a sickening thud and slumped to the ground, unconscious but breathing. The remaining bounty hunters stared at Magnus with undisguised terror, their weapons forgotten in the face of his overwhelming presence. These were hard men accustomed to violence, but they'd never encountered anything like the giant who just dismantled their leader without killing him. "Leave," Magnus said simply. "Take your wounded and go. Don't come back." The survivors didn't argue. They gathered their injured companions and disappeared into the forest with the desperate haste of men who'd glimpsed their own mortality. Within minutes, Magnus stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by the debris of battle, but victorious in ways that went far beyond physical conquest. He'd faced the violence that had shaped his bloodline and chosen restraint over savagery, protection over destruction. The darkness was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him. He was more than his father's son, more than the sum of his worst moments. Magnus turned back toward the cabin, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline of battle began to fade. Through the doorway he could see Esther May sitting up in bed, their son cradled against her chest. The baby's blanket, woven from the finest materials they could provide, caught the morning light, a perfect blend of his mountain skills and her domestic artistry. "Is it over?" Esther May asked as Magnus approached. "It's over," Magnus confirmed, settling carefully beside her on the narrow bunk. "They won't be back." Esther May leaned against his shoulder, exhaustion and relief warring in her expression. "You didn't kill them." "No," Magnus said quietly. "I wanted to, especially Cartwright, but our son deserves better than that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their child sleep peacefully in the hand-carved cradle. The baby was beautiful in the way all newborns were beautiful. Perfect in his helplessness, unlimited in his potential. Magnus found himself making silent promises to the tiny form, vows about the kind of father he would become, the kind of legacy he would leave. "What will we name him?" Esther May asked softly. Magnus considered the question, thinking of his own violent heritage and the possibility of breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. "James," he said finally, after you're intended. A good man deserves to be remembered. Esther May's eyes filled with tears of grief, gratitude, and overwhelming love. James Thorne, she whispered, testing the name. It sounds perfect. Outside, the mountain morning was peaceful again, the violence of the past few hours already becoming memory. But inside the cabin, a new chapter was beginning. One written not in blood and brutality, but in love and hope and the quiet determination to build something better than what had come before. Magnus reached into the cradle and gently touched his son's face, marveling at the softness of the baby's skin. This child would grow up knowing love instead of fear, protection instead of violence, the security of parents who'd chosen each other despite every obstacle. The baby's blanket, their first collaborative creation as a family, would be treasured. Always a reminder of the morning when love had triumphed over violence, and a giant of a man had discovered that the greatest strength lay not in destruction, but in the tender protection of those who mattered most. As the sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains, Magnus Thorne held his family close and allowed himself to believe that some stories could have happy endings after all. 6 months later, the tin-type photographer from Denver captured an image that would become treasured beyond all their other possessions. Magnus sat stiffly in the chair the photographer had reinforced to accommodate his massive frame, while Esther May stood beside him in her finest dress, their son James cradled carefully in her arms. The baby gazed solemnly at the camera, with eyes that already promised his father's intelligence and his mother's gentle strength. The family portrait sat in a place of honor on the mantel of their expanded cabin, a testament to the impossible. Love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. Magnus had added 2 rooms to the structure during the spring, creating space for their growing family and the domestic happiness he'd never imagined possible. The changes to their home reflected the deeper transformation in Magnus himself. The man who'd lived in solitary isolation for 15 years now found his days filled with the sounds of family life, Esther May's humming as she worked, James's gurgling laughter, the rustle of domesticity that had once seemed foreign, and now felt essential as breathing. Pine Ridge had gradually accepted Magnus as one of their own, though the process hadn't been without its challenges. The townspeople had needed time to reconcile their fear of the mountain giant with the reality of the gentle father who brought his family to church each Sunday and helped his neighbors with tasks that required his unique strength. Tom Morrison had been among the first to extend genuine friendship, recognizing the debt the community owed to the man who'd protected them from what they'd believed was a Ute threat. Turns out, having a guardian angel who stands 8 feet tall isn't such a bad thing, Morrison had joked after learning the truth about Cartwright's deception. The Henderson family had become their closest friends, their children serving as playmates for James, and their home a second sanctuary for Magnus. When the weight of community attention became overwhelming, Tom Henderson had dropped his stubborn insistence on defending his remote homestead, moving his family closer to town after gaining a new appreciation for the value of neighbors and mutual protection. Magnus had found work as the settlement's unofficial protector and arbitrator of disputes. His reputation for fairness and his obvious devotion to his family gradually overcoming the fears his size had once inspired. The irony wasn't lost on him that the violence he'd fled to the mountains to escape had, when tempered by love and purpose, become the foundation for his acceptance into civilized society. Esther May had established herself as Pine Ridge's premier seamstress, her skills in demand throughout the territory. But more than her professional reputation, it was her gentle influence on Magnus that had won the community's respect. People could see how the feared mountain man softened in her presence, how his harsh features relaxed into tenderness when she spoke, how completely he'd been transformed by love. Their son James thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and healthy under the devoted care of parents who'd waited a lifetime to experience such happiness. The baby had inherited his father's size, already larger than children twice his age, but his temperament seemed blessedly free from the darkness that had haunted the Thorne bloodline. Magnus spent hours each evening carving toys for his son, his massive hands creating delicate wooden animals and simple puzzles, with the same attention to detail he'd once devoted to his rifle stocks. The baby's nursery filled gradually with these handmade treasures, each piece a tangible expression of paternal love. "He's going to be spoiled beyond all reason," Esther May observed one evening, watching Magnus present James with an intricately carved wooden horse. "Good," Magnus replied without hesitation. "He should know he's treasured, should grow up certain of his worth." It was a deliberate choice to shower their son with the affection Magnus had never received, to break the cycle of harsh neglect that had shaped his own childhood. James would know love as his birthright rather than violence as his inheritance. The cabin itself had become a gathering place for the community's children, drawn by Magnus's patient storytelling and the fascinating woodworking projects that emerged from his workshop. Parents who'd once hurried their offspring away from the fearsome giant now encouraged friendships that taught their children to look beyond surface appearances to find the gentle heart beneath. "Tell us about the bear again, Mr. Magnus," little Billy Henderson would plead, settling cross-legged on the floor with the other children. Magnus would oblige with tales of wilderness encounters, always emphasizing respect for nature and the importance of understanding rather than fearing the wild creatures that shared their mountain home. These stories, woven with gentle humor and practical wisdom, had become legend among Pine Ridge's youngest residents. Esther May watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction, recognizing how completely her husband had embraced his role as protector and teacher to the entire community. The man who'd once believed himself too dangerous for human company had become the person others turned to for guidance and comfort. Their marriage had been formalized in a simple ceremony at the Pine Ridge Church, with the entire community in attendance to witness the union that had already been blessed by love and parenthood. Magnus had worn his only good suit, specially tailored to accommodate his extraordinary frame, while Esther May had sewn her own wedding dress from silk she'd ordered specially from Denver. The ceremony had been interrupted only once, when baby James had begun crying during the exchange of vows. Magnus had gently taken his son from Esther May's arms, holding the baby against his chest until the crying subsided into contented gurgling. The image of the giant man soothing his child while pledging eternal love to his bride had brought tears to every eye in the congregation. Now, as winter approached once again, Magnus found himself looking forward to the season he'd once endured in isolation. This year would bring family traditions, reading by the fire while James slept, teaching Esther May the wilderness skills that would keep them all safe, planning improvements to their home that would accommodate their growing family. For Esther, May was carrying again, a development that filled Magnus with joy and protective anxiety in equal measure. The thought of another child, perhaps a daughter this time, expanded his definition of happiness beyond anything he'd thought possible. "Do you ever regret it?" Esther May asked one evening as they sat before the fire, James sleeping peacefully, in the carved cradle that had become the symbol of their family's beginning. "Giving up the solitude you valued so much?" Magnus considered the question seriously, looking around their home filled with signs of domestic happiness. The family portrait gazed down from the mantel, capturing a moment of perfect contentment. Esther May's sewing occupied one corner, James's toys another. The sense of home-cooked meals and baby powder had replaced the stark emptiness of his bachelor existence. "Solitude was never what I valued," Magnus said finally. "Safety was what I valued, keeping others safe from what I thought I might become. But I learned something important these past months." "What's that?" "Love doesn't make us weaker. It makes us capable of becoming who we were always meant to be." Esther May smiled, settling more comfortably against his side. "And who were you?" Meant to be. Magnus looked down at his sleeping son, then at the woman who'd seen past his fearsome exterior to find the heart he'd thought permanently broken. A husband, a father, a man who builds rather than destroys. Outside, snow began to fall in the first storm of the season, but the cabin remained warm and bright with the light of family love. The family portrait on the mantel would soon be joined by others, images of birthdays and holidays, of their children's first steps and school celebrations, of all the ordinary miracles that comprised a life well lived. Magnus Thorne had found his way home at last, not to a place but to a purpose. The violence that had driven him to the mountains remained part of his nature, but it now served love rather than ruling it. He was the guardian of everything precious in his world, and that guardianship had transformed him from a man fleeing his demons into a man who'd learned to make peace with them. Sometimes the heart finds love in the most unexpected places, with the most unlikely people. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, that love has the power to remake us entirely, turning monsters into men and solitary souls into the beating hearts of families that will endure for generations. The snow continued to fall outside there. Mountain home, but inside warmth reigned eternal, the kind of warmth that comes not from fire, but from the steady burning of love that has found its true home at last.